textbook says the whale has a vestigial pelvis. Many organisms retain traces of their evolutionary history. For example, the whale retains pelvic and leg bones as useless vestiges. National Center for Science Education teaches, Bossy the cow evolved to blowho the whale. The cow evolved to the whale. And the evidence is the pelvis. Whales have a pelvis, vestigial pelvis and leg bone that serve no purpose. They have hind limb bones that have no function. Just imagine whales walking around. It's true. Well, here's the bones they're talking about right there. Just imagine the whale walking around. I have tried and tried to imagine, and I just can't do it. Almost every type of whale has these bones right there in the abdomen. They are not attached to the spine. That's correct. Textbook says the whale's pelvis is located far from the vertebra and has no apparent function. The whale's pelvis is evidence of its evolution from four-legged, land-dwelling mammals. This is a lie. Those little bones are anchor points that special muscles attach to that allow the whales to reproduce. Whales are kind of big, you know, and without those special muscles and those special bones, they can't get more baby whales. So either these guys are ignorant about their whale anatomy or they're lying to your kids trying to spread their theory. But it's not true that those are vestigial, okay? There are no vestigial organs, and if there were, think about it, that would be the opposite of evolution. That's losing, not gaining.
Well, I guess that's it. Scientists are dumb because they think that whale reproductive bones are vestigial pelvises. But they aren't, according to a man who, despite calling himself Dr. Dino, doesn't know what a dinosaur is. Okay. Maybe scientists didn't catch the dumb when describing whales. Let's look at a whale skeleton. Whales are pretty unusual when it comes to mammals. The forelimb girdle is pretty standard, except for those freaky phalanges. But it does appear that whales lack a pelvis, at least in an ordinary sense. Those little bones here are the whale's pelvis, femur, and a lower leg bone, probably a tibia. Only the pelvis is really what we're talking about. But most of what I say about the pelvis will also apply to the leg bones. Okay, well, how do we know that's what they are then? For this, we will have to dig into evolutionary developmental biology, or Evo-Devo as it's called. You've probably heard of Ernst Haeckel and his embryo drawings. He came up with the law that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is to say that as an animal grows from a zygote, it passes through the adult forms of its evolutionary ancestors. This is wrong, but it doesn't mean that embryology doesn't give us interesting information about the evolution of animals. You probably haven't heard of Carl Ernst von Baer. He came up with the laws of embryology that have actually held up. There are 4 of these laws, and here they are. The more general characters of a large group appear earlier in the embryo than the more special characters. For example, the notochord develops before the limbs, and the limbs develop before the hair in a mammal. From the most general forms, the less general are developed, and so on, until finally the most special arises. Embryos tend to look pretty similar early on, and diverge into specialized forms revealing their adult identity later. Every embryo of a given animal form, instead of passing through the other forms, rather becomes separated from them. Contrary to Haeckel's so-called law, animals do not pass through the adult stage of other forms. Rather, they diverge from the embryonic forms of such animals. The embryo of a higher form never resembles any other form, but only its embryo. For example, a human embryo never looks like an adult fish or lizard, but it does look like a fish embryo and a lizard embryo at certain points of development. Embryos develop according to instructions from certain regulatory genes, such as homeobox genes, that give signals causing cells to do one of a small number of things. Embryonic cells can divide, or grow, fold, undergo apoptosis or die, and finally differentiate into particular cell types like neurons, muscle cells, or osteocytes. Essentially, these instructions are more like the folding diagram for origami than the blueprints for a house. They choreograph a dance of growth, change, and death, rather than being a representation of the final product. Because different animals start off as similar embryos, and the time when their embryos start to differentiate gets later the more similar the animals are, we can use embryology to check to see what parts of an animal are homologous. Homologous structures are essentially the same feature in different organisms. So your radius and ulna are homologous to the radius and ulna in a whale, a bird, a horse, a lizard, or any other tetrapod. We know this not just because the bones are in about the same place and arrangement in all tetrapods, but also because they all develop from the same embryonic structures in the anterior limb buds. This is important because it means that from a structural standpoint, the only difference between different animals is how long and when certain features develop and grow. If a human embryo got the same regulatory signals during embryonic development as a dog, it would come out looking essentially like a dog, even though its biochemistry would be 100% human. Of course, there's really no way to make this happen, and I hope no one tries it, at least not with a human. I kinda like you monkeys. This is how we know that even very different structures are homologous. For example, jaw bones in reptiles, ear bones in mammals, and gill arches in lampreys are all homologous. We know because they develop from the same embryonic features, that is, pharyngeal arches. That's why before we ever found the fossils that would confirm it, we knew that the fish jaw evolved from gill arches, and that mammal ear bones evolved from those same gill arches that had already been turned into jaw bones. And interestingly, you can see mammal ear bones migrating from near the jaw into the ear during embryonic development. What does this have to do with those tiny whale bones Kent was blathering about? Well, cetaceans, like all tetrapods, form 4 limb buds, 2 for the hind legs, 2 for the front legs. In cetaceans, the hind limb buds stop growing almost immediately, and the rest of the body more or less absorbs them. But at the same time, the tissues in the limb bud that in all tetrapods become the pelvic girdle, in whales, become those bones in question. Further, the leg bones that some whales have also develop from the hind limb bud. So we know that those bones are the remnants of a pelvis precisely because they have the same embryonic development. They are the same thing as your hip bones, coming from the same place on an essentially identical embryo, in a developmental process that conforms to all of von Baer's laws of embryology. There are even more clues to this. Whales, like all mammals, have different kinds of vertebrae. From front to back, they are cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and caudal. The sacral and lumbar vertebrae are basically the same, but anterior to the bones in question, an interesting change happens in the spine. The vertebrae become distinct as caudal vertebrae, and this also marks the end of the organs in a whale that a different mammal would have in their abdominal cavity, such as intestines. So just like in other mammals, these bones are associated with the change to caudal vertebrae. So we can now say with some certainty that these bones are the vestigial remnants of the pelvis of the whale's ancestors, and we didn't even have to use a single fossil to do it, although fossil evidence has confirmed this too. Okay, but Hovind pointed out that these bones have very important functions, and you know what? He's actually right about that. In fact, I would go so far as to say that without these bones, whales couldn't reproduce. So does that mean that these bones aren't vestigial? Well, no, not even a little bit. All being vestigial means is that an organ is reduced and no longer performs the basal purpose. That is, it doesn't do what it did in an animal's ancestors. In fact, you could say that some of your ear bones are actually vestigial gills. They are certainly reduced, and good luck breathing underwater with your ears. But having a present function doesn't make a structure not vestigial. Human tailbones are vestiges simply because they don't form a tail, even if they do still attach some important muscles. But what about the fact that these pelvic bones in whales differ between males and females? I'm honestly not sure that they do differ, but I'm willing to just say that they do because I can't see why that makes them not vestigial pelvises. Think back to when you were a kid and someone gave you the talk about the birds and the bees. That's probably when you learned where babies come from, and that part of that process is that the infant has to pass through the hips of the female carrying it. For example, here's a picture of a male human pelvis. Look at the hole at the bottom. It's rather narrow. Now, here's a female human pelvis. Notice how the bottom is wider than in the male. That's because the male doesn't have to fit another human the size of a watermelon through the bottom of his pelvis, but the female does.
Fat bottom girls, you make the rockin' world go round.
So, a different pelvic structure for males and females isn't exactly unexpected. Rather, it would be strange if the hips of a mammal weren't a bit sexually dimorphic. Even if the spacing of the hips to accommodate birth in females isn't really an issue for a particular organism, the pelvis is still where muscles for the genitals attach. And since these are of necessity different in different sexes, especially so for mammals, one would expect the pelvises to differ a bit simply to accommodate these muscle attachments. Ironically, it seems that in pointing out the reproductive nature of whale pelvises, Kent has actually given us more evidence that confirms what Evo Devo has taught us about whale pelvises. If you want more information on Evo Devo at a layperson's level, I'd recommend Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth. For those of you wary because of his harsh criticisms of religion and his honestly rather shaky understanding of philosophy, don't worry. This book is just about the science and doesn't touch on topics of morality, God, or philosophy. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. If I can get to 100 subs, I'm going to do a 100 sub special. As of writing this, I'm at 44 subs, so 56 more to go. Also, if you'd like to support the channel more directly, but without sending me or YouTube or anyone else money, please consider rendering on my behalf. Instructions for how to do so are in the description. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.